Hello, welcome back to the magic show in the mind, sensing and perceiving. Magicians make their living playing tricks on willing participants. Audience members and passersby alike are entertained and sometimes even mystified by these sleights of hand and other forms of legerdemain. Many of these performances are considered incredible. People say they cannot believe their eyes. But what if I told you that these tricks have much less to do with the magician's talent than you might think? It may sound surprising, even preposterous, but the magic, the real magic, is taking place inside each and every one of you. That's right, it is in your brain that makes this whole experience possible. You are the magician's favorite assistant. Illusions are fun to participate in, like play or comedy or sport. Illusions otherwise give humans who are typically overly concerned and overly serious an opportunity to enjoy uncertainty, to enjoy ambiguity. Consider the following. Is this a sticky bun? Could it be Mother Teresa? What about this one? What do you see here? Is this a charred slice of bread or a photographic image from a 1920s movie star? It's almost as if we're primed to see faces everywhere we look. David Hume, the great philosopher, certainly thought so. He wrote about it several hundred years ago, saying there's a human tendency among mankind to conceive all beings like themselves and to transfer to every object those qualities with which they are familiarly acquainted and of which they are intimately conscious. He said, we find human faces in the moon, armies in the clouds, and by natural propensity, if not corrected by experience and reflection, ascribe malice or goodwill to everything that hurts or pleases us. The dress. I remember this. It was all the rage. Several years ago, you couldn't look on the internet without seeing an homage to this. People lost their collective minds over this image. One seemingly innocent piece of media. The rub? What color do you see? Can you believe that there was no consensus? Seriously, about half the internet said the dress they were looking at was definitely gold and white, while the other half said definitively, convincingly, that it was blue and black. How is this possible? The first thing I want you to know is that research into color perception began in earnest with a researcher named Humboldt in the 1800s. He put forth the trichromatic theory of color vision, which states that color depends upon a mixture of the signals that our brain receives from the different kinds of color receptors located in our eyes in an area called the retina. But for this theory, and this dress were left lacking. You see, the trichromatic theory of color perception does not quite explain this 50-50 split. If we all have the same visual hardware, the same color cones or color receptors in our retinas, shouldn't we all, at least most all of us, agree on what color this dress is? Intuition is a powerful thing. Just consider our feelings about seeing, for instance. Most people feel as if that's pretty straightforward, pretty simple. To see the world, all one needs to do is open his eyes. And provided that your eyes are like a majority of people's eyes, that is normal, provided that your anatomy and physiology is functioning properly, you'll perceive the world just fine. You'll generate conscious images inside your mind's eye that faithfully match what it is that's in the real world. That is what your eyes are detecting. In this way, vision or any other energy detecting system, whether it be audition, gustation or taste, olfaction or smell, or what we call somatosensation, our skin, our tactile system, is merely playing back what's available to us in reality. Again, this is deeply intuitive, but fantastically flawed. The nature of reality is sometimes viewed as terribly trivial by many, while others look upon it as a deeply philosophical and esoteric question. I want you to think about it somewhere in the middle. To do that, we should begin with a story. It's a story as old as time. Boy falls victim to a curse and is immediately turned into a beastly ogre. A beautiful princess kidnapped by this beast and held hostage in his lair. Both eventually fall in love. Beast is turned back into a handsome prince. Everybody lives happily ever after. This is a fairy tale, no doubt, right? This is not an accurate reflection of reality. Nobody could fall in love with their kidnapper. Who could ever love such a dastardly beast? And love alone could never turn a beast back into a prince, right? Maybe not. Disney is not the only source of fantastical storytelling. I want you to remember, as I've mentioned before, each and every one of us is capable of this kind of narration. Brains are like smartphones. All of us have the same fundamental wiring. Like a smartphone, any smartphone, we come straight out of the box. That is, we're born with certain things. You can think of these as our hardware. Like a smartphone, our baby brains come equipped with a handful of general purpose codes. Most of us will learn a language, detect various energies, experience emotions, and be driven essentially not to die too early. Also, like a smartphone, most of the uniqueness, the nuance, the functionality for the day-to-day decision-making we will need will be added on the fly. That is, if you are a smartphone user, you will need to add and remove various applications throughout your time with that phone. Likewise, the hardware we are born with is only a start. We must use what some refer to as culture or our life histories to ensure that we build the necessary software to solve the infinite number of challenges we will no doubt face throughout our lives. I'd like to return for a moment to the wiring I mentioned earlier. Human bodies are connected via a series of wires running to and fro. These wires, called nerves, make up our central and peripheral nervous systems. You may remember that chief among the components of our central nervous system is the brain and spinal cord, while most everything else is considered peripheral. It is these peripherals or sense organs that are largely responsible for all the raw data that our bodies receive. The environmental signals, the inputs that are bombarding our nervous system every millisecond of every day. But again, this is not where reality is made. I mean, how could it be? Again, it's important to understand that we don't actually experience these inputs or the detection therein. Instead, we are only ever aware of output. It is our perceptions, which of course are generated by our brains, that create this output. Again, we are full of sense receptors. They are distributed throughout, beneath most every inch of our body. These receptors make up our sensory organs and are incapable of giving us perception. They're far too picky, far too finely tuned for giving us meaning. Instead, they are made to detect specific energies, each falling within a narrow range. For example, we use photoreceptors, sense receptors in the back of our eyes to detect light, but not sound, not pressure waves, not volatile molecules emanating off of everything from an apple pie to someone's perfume. What's more, our eyes can only detect a tiny sliver of the available energy. As you see here, about 400 to 700 nanometers. Light is made up of waves. And like many other types of energy, light is bombarding our bodies all the time. However, it is only in our eyes that we have the right type of detection cellular machinery called cones and rods that we're able to detect, pick up, absorb this fraction of the electromagnetic spectrum. There is more energy below 400 nanometers, or below violet, ultraviolet, X-rays, gamma rays if you go out far enough. And there's certainly way more energy above 700 nanometers. Wavelengths that are much, much longer. Infrared, all the way to radio waves. In other words, there's more than meets our eye. Our eyes simply did not evolve, couldn't care less about detecting this energy. The Hidden Translator. So we depend upon millions of sensory receptors to gather as much stimuli as possible from our environment. But we need the brain to decode, to extract meaning from this information. But how is it possible, given the nature of incoming energies and what we know about how the brain works? To answer this question, we need to think about translation. Whether a sign language interpreter or a radio transducer, there are many examples of inputs throughout our world, throughout our experience, being converted or transduced, to use the technical term, from one form of energy to another. Sometimes, as in the case of a state secret, we need to encrypt our messages so that others can't decipher or discern what we're talking about. At other times, the inscrutable needs to be deciphered. That is, what happens inside every sensory cell in your body. An automatic process outside of even your awareness is taking place. These cells in your eyes, ears, mouth, nose, and skin are constantly converting or transducing, as it were, physical energy into electromagnetic energy. Why do we need this to happen? Because the mechanical or the physical energies that come from the world around us, say for instance the wavelengths that emanate from the visible spectrum, are not the kinds of information that our brain can make sense of, that our brains can use, let alone assign meaning. But doesn't that take us back where we started from? Many discerning students have pointed out that converting one form of energy, like light waves, into another form of energy, like an electrochemical or neural energy, leaves us kind of in the same place. How does this neural energy bring us any closer to understanding the nature of human perception? We go from something as obscure as waves of energy that we call light to a series of biochemical impulses traveling to and from throughout the brain and rest of the body, traversing literally trillions of synapses. If we could look inside the machine, if we could peek inside the hood, like a mechanic does to a car that's not working, and see the inner workings of human perception, what do you suppose we would see? I would offer probably nothing even remotely approaching what we would expect. Given our experiences, what we would find inside the brain would be extraordinarily different. There would be no shape, for instance, no color, no depth, no movement, nothing high, nothing low, nothing big, small, nothing sweet, sour, naughty or nice, nothing good, bad, or ugly or in between. Instead, if we could examine, if we could really peer into the human black box of our brain, we'd be terribly surprised by the vastness of the seemingly nothingness inside. And inside is where we are. It's where you are. It's where the self resides. And many believe that we're trapped inside. Much like a fish does not know it's swimming in water, we do not know that we are trapped inside this brain. Why would the contents of our brains more likely reveal raw binary code than the dreamlike story quality narrative we seem to enjoy each and every second of our existence? Why is this? Because the brain, like I said, is locked inside a dark cranium where no sensory information can breach. All the brain ever is, all the brain ever could be aware of, is a bunch of whirling, swirling electrochemical streams. What's more, the version of reality that your brain serves up to you in the form of conscious perceptions is merely an illusion at best. If your perceptions were to ever correlate with actual reality, it would be a mere coincidence. And I would like to reassure you right now by saying that's okay. In fact, it's more than okay. We may be marooned on this island, trapped inside our sensory organs. We may be limited in our perceptual abilities and our perceptual accuracy, but it works as long as these perceptions generated by the brain are useful, are functional. I can smell you from here. We are, to use the German word, trapped inside or on an Umwelt. Umwelt refers to our own unique world as it is experienced by you and or me. Some species have larger Umwelts while others have more confined Umwelts. It's important to understand that bigger does not necessarily mean better in this context. While it is true, for instance, that a bloodhound can far outmatch humans for their sense of smell, capable of detecting food source a couple of miles away, bears, by contrast, are even better than bloodhounds. They can smell you and me up to 25 miles away. But instead of feeling discouraged or insufficient, we just have to remember that we're the ones that have the guns. Instead of thinking about our biases, misinterpretations, inaccuracies, and perceptual limitations as bugs, we should think of them as features. Again, if it's accuracy that matters to us, then we're in real trouble. However, I would argue that what matters to us, heck, what matters to any species, is the functionality of that information, is how useful those perceptions are. To the extent that our brains, our perceptual system, generate a reality that is functional, that assists us in not dying too early, this system, albeit inaccurate, far from truth-making, is nevertheless beneficial. In fact, a system could not only generate its own reality, but potentially change or edit that reality on the fly would be even more powerful. And I submit to you that that is exactly the kind of system we have. A malleable, flexible, limber system where meaning drives our perceptions, not the other way around. The past shapes our future, both the recent as well as the long evolutionary past. Our histories are made up of what happened yesterday, what happened when we were children, what happened when our parents were children, their parents were children, on back, so on and so forth throughout evolutionary time. Long evolutionary expanses of time were responsible for building the hardware or the fundamental code upon which our minds work. These built-in codes have and continue to serve not only our species, but many species very well. Whereas the more proximate, the more recent past, our own lifetimes, our own parents' lifetimes, probably better explain the more specific, nuanced perceptions that we generate to help us carve out an existence on this earth. Principles of perceptual organization. Researchers interested in the relationship between sensation, that is, taking in, absorbing the world, and perception, that is, meaning-making, organizing, interpreting the world around us, are called psychophysicists. And these psychophysicists have attempted to understand the so-called hardwired rules by which perceptions are made for more than 100 years. Gestalt, as they were once called, researchers discovered organizing principles. Some of the first rules by which our brains organize the world. Take a look at a few here. They'll give us some insight, at the very least, into how humans perceive form. The G in Gestalt is actually not a G. It's missing some parts. But according to the perceptual principle of organization discovered 100 or more years ago called closure, the human brain tends to be biased towards closing pieces into a meaningful whole. That is, we tend to be biased towards making sense of what would otherwise not make any sense. And one way we do this is by putting things together or closing them. Proximity is another. Notice the E is not actually an E. Notice those dots are not actually identical. They're their own unique dots. However, they're so close to one another that they're seen as part of an overall whole. Continuity is next with the S. Perhaps that's an S, or perhaps those are just merely some arcs. It's hard to say exactly because there appears to be a cylinder passing through the S. How do we know that's a complete S? How do we know the part that is hidden behind the cylinder continues? We just assume that it does. Like a person lying under a car whose hand is sticking out invisible to the person that walks into the garage. The person walking into the garage hears, "Pass me a wrench." What is the brain to assume? The brain uses the Gestalt principle of organization and says, I believe that arm is connected to a thorax or a trunk, and that trunk is connected to other parts, and those parts are connected to a person or create a person that just asked for a wrench. Most people don't run out of the garage screaming because a disembodied arm asked them a question. Enclosure, figured ground, similarity, connection, and many others form the science of Gestaltism. And these principles, many that I have not placed on the screen, can be found in your textbook. Believing is seeing, bottom up versus top down. You've probably heard the phrase seeing is believing before, but what if I suggested to you that that's actually upside down? You'd probably not agree with me, would you? It's hard to imagine that believing comes first, and then based upon what you believe, that's going to create what it is that you see, or for that matter, hear, smell, taste, feel. It's hard to believe that what you perceive, the reality your brain generates, is based upon your past history, your prior beliefs, and therefore the predictions or the expectations your brain is constantly making. It is the belief of many perceptual scientists that the human brain has an innate tendency to perceive patterns, even where none exist. You may have seen elsewhere some of these examples. Top-down processing speaks or reminds us of this. What do you see? Well, that's largely dependent upon the context, upon your past experience, upon your expectations. It's a B. It's obviously a B, right? I mean, it couldn't be anything but a B. And if that's what you said, you're right. I mean, just look. It fits nicely in between A and C. But of course, B's can look very different. This one appears to be an incomplete one. But again, I just mentioned that the Gestalt principle of closure would predict that you would see that as a B, that you'd go ahead and close those open-ended geometric shapes up. If you didn't see a B, chances are you saw a 13. I mean, it's clear as day, right? Of course, it couldn't be anything but a 13. Again, that is if you were thinking about numbers. If you had a top-down prediction, if you had expectations driving your perception. To go back, you're limited. You don't have a lot of anchor points, a lot of things to compare or contrast. You don't have a context here. So the fact of the matter is, this could be a B. This could be a 13. This could be both. This could be neither. Which is right? Maybe neither. Maybe both. But the better answer would be the one that's most useful. Accuracy is less important. I've already said this. To your brain, what it wants is usefulness. It wants functionality. It wants to help you not die, at least not before you pass on your genetics. The tendency to perceive things based upon the way we expect or predict them to be is a matter of our past histories. We use a sort of statistical process upon which averages or probabilities of what is most likely to happen given a known context is what we perceive. And I've already said previously, we have a perceptual system that is limber, that is plastic or malleable. We're capable of going back and forth with our perceptions. We can generate one reality one minute and another the next. Just take a look. Which way is the image spinning? Is it spinning clockwise? Most of you probably see it spinning clockwise. Would you believe that that has less to do with the objective reality and more to do with your past history? Don't believe me? Let me ask you to try something. I want you to imagine that you are lying on the ground and you're looking up at this spinning object. This spinning object is what you see while lying on the ground. You're looking from below it. Is it still spinning in the same direction? Or has it changed? Now, by the way, I'd like for you to go back and start thinking about this object, start perceiving this object from the perspective of looking down on it. I want you to imagine that the object is below you and that you are 10, 15 feet above it looking at the spinning object. What do you notice? It tends to turn and spin the other way. It can't be spinning both directions, can it? That's right, it can't. In fact, what if I told you it's not spinning at all? That's right. That it is spinning is merely an illusion created by your brain. What we know objectively, because we know how people make these illusions, is that this is simply a series of lights projecting on and off at a particular speed in a particular order, giving us the illusion of movement. Not only does your brain tell you this is spinning or moving, you can actually change the direction again merely by changing your mental perception, sometimes referred to as perceptual set. Very similar to what we saw earlier in this demonstration. Is it a 13? Well, that depends upon the set or the context. Perhaps it's a B. Is this spinning right or left? It depends upon how you perceive it. It depends upon your perspective. Are you looking down on it or are you looking up? Before I stop, I'd like to wrap things up a little bit. I want you to remember that far from being inadequate, insufficient, far from being problematic or bad at perception, I want you to know that just because you can't perceive the world completely accurately, just because you may never know objective truth, does not mean that what you are capable of isn't amazing. The goal, read with me, isn't to extract truth from the universe, but instead build a version that is useful. Objective reality may be less or more, or only coincidentally the same as your perception. Don't let it bother you. What's important to an organism like you and me is that you have a story-making device and the associated software to interpret, organize, and make meaning, especially where that meaning does not exist. And remember, the meaning that you make does not need to be accurate or objectively valid. It only needs to be useful. To the extent that it keeps you from not dying, then it is a feature, not a bug. I'll see you next time. Thanks for your time and attention. Enjoy your spring break, guys.